Welcome to CFO 4.0, the future of finance. The CFO role is changing rapidly, moving from cost controller to strategic visionary. And with every change comes opportunity. We are here to help you take advantage of this transition, to win at work, drive your career forwards, and lead with confidence. Join Hannah Munro, Managing Director of ITAS, a financial transformation consultancy, as she interviews key experts to give you real-world advice and guidance on how to transform your processes, people, and data. Welcome to CFO 4.0, the future of finance.
So hello everybody and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. I'm very privileged to say we have our resident CFO coach, Mr. Jeremy Earnshaw, back on the show to give us the insights into how to develop your career as a CFO. So welcome, Jeremy. So great to have you back on the show.
Thank you, Hannah. Nice to be here again and to talk about this particular subject, which hopefully is an interesting one for the audience.
Absolutely, and weirdly enough, I actually had on a recent episode a CFO that had successfully transitioned from CFO role to NED, and he kind of gave his perspective. But you know, I know it's a hot topic, and a lot of people are interested in that shift. But how do you? I'm going to start with the first question. Like, how do you see the NED role, and is it a great sort of step up for CFOs? Is it sort of the next step, and what should you be considering before making that jump?
Three questions in one, so I'll try and do that like
Yes.
a politician answering a journalist there. I think it is very different, actually, Hannah. And one of the pieces of advice I was given quite an early stage was almost along the lines of, for everything you think you've learnt in an executive career, you need to begin to unlearn that and think with a different mindset. So when I asked that particular individual what he meant by it, it was, this isn't about being a part-time executive for 1 or 2 days a month. This is about being a full-time strategic non-executive director on call. And I think those things are quite different. So all of your technical expertise, all of your subject matter expertise in whatever discipline is very helpful. But very, very much like when a CFO joins a board, all of a sudden you're not just responsible for finance, you're responsible for the organization with a specific responsibility for finance as your discipline. And I think the same applies to be a non-executive director. You're there for the strategy of the organization. You have to have your hands off, but your eyes and ears on. And I think also there's a different mindset around the practicalities of being an NED, in that it might not necessarily work within a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 structured environment. Some of the most challenging conversations I've had as a current NED have been in and around situations which require dealing with straight away, particularly in the case of a listed entity or issues that have arisen in an organization, good and bad, but they need responding to very quickly. I think the other thing to think about when considering an NED role, I'll give you an example. When I began to want to get more interested in being an active NED, probably 7 or 8 years ago, and you make contact with people, you respond to the question when asked, have you got the time commitment available to be a non-executive director? And I, in a very blasé way, replied at that stage, of course I've got the time. I've got flexibility with my current executive role. Of course I've got the time. If I look back on that now, I think that was a long way away from the reality. My personal view is it's very difficult to be an active NED and an active full-time executive for those reasons that we just described. So I think it does require an availability of time. It does require a strategic mindset shift into being very, very strategic. So eyes and ears on and hands off.
And you talk there about the time commitment. Does every NED role have a similar time commitment, or is that something that is valid to ask when you're going into?
I think it is. My assessment so far, and I've been very fortunate to do 4 very different current NED roles, and they really do vary because they are across sectors and they're across different types of organizations as well. And if I think about the time commitment, I'd probably say in each case, the contracted time commitment has been exceeded by the actual time commitment. So whether we think it's 2 days a month or 3 days a month, whatever that time commitment is, I'd probably think my own personal experience, double it, because it's when it's required. And just going back to the earlier point, Hannah, it's not something that when you get to there's the set piece events, there's the board days, the strategy days, the regular catch-ups with executives, and then there's the ad hoc elements. And I think it's the ad hoc elements which require that availability of time to be able to commit to something. And I think that is quite difficult to do as an active executive. Not impossible, but just makes it more difficult. And some of the ad hoc elements you tend to do perhaps out of regular hours. You make commitments, depends where the business is based internationally, for example. So if you've got representatives of the organization in the Far East, in the US, it's going to make things a little bit more difficult to structure. So I think my advice would be to really think about the commitments. And that may vary as well between, say, a regulated environment and a private sector stroke listed environment as well. Lots of commitment in the regulated sector. So I think it is very much worth asking the question, what's the commitment, and making sure you have the time available to do that.
So I'm going to ask maybe an obvious question or not, but we'll see. Why should you do it? What value, having done a few roles, did you get out of doing that NED role?
Yeah, no, perfectly reasonable question, and I wanted to do it not for the status, not for the money. I did it because I felt I could actually make a real difference, and perhaps that reflects my background as well. It's the case with anybody else searching for an NED role. There's really fantastic reasons why people get these roles, for all sorts of different reasons as well, because they might have unbelievably aligned experience in an FT 100, 250, 350 small cap company in a listed environment. Maybe it's fantastic experience in a regulated environment. So I think I felt I could, with a background that I've had, which has been above SME but lower than FT 250 organizations, mostly in a growth environment, mostly within organizations that have had quite a big debt book. I've raised equity. So all of the things that I've been very fortunate to be presented with in an executive career, some of which went well and some of which went not so well, I thought I was in a really good position to say, I can offer that to boards and to executives, and also use my element of coaching and mentoring as well to take that approach. So one of the questions I've been asked a number of times is, well, what's your approach around a boardroom table as a non-exec director? And I respond by saying, well, you would expect me to say this anyway, but my approach is a coaching and mentoring approach. So I'm looking to develop what the business case is. I'm looking to find out what the blockers are to achieve something within an organization. And that coaching and mentoring approach is my style, and it might not be for everybody. If I think about some of the really good and perhaps not so good non-exec directors as well, I've been fortunate to be working in organizations with non-exec directors since 1992. So the good qualities I can pick out from people are as follows, Hannah. They are eyes on, ears on, hands off. They back the executives having challenged them. They don't necessarily disagree with the executives just because they have a different opinion. They challenge you, but even if they don't necessarily agree with the opinion that you're taking, if the business case has been presented, they back the executives. The really good non-executives have a relationship with the executives outside of the boardroom. So you're not just in effect meeting somebody for the first time every 2 or 4 weeks. There's at least some kind of foundation relationship where you know broadly the way that they think and the way that they like to work. I had one particular non-exec director I'm thinking of who was unbelievably clear in the way that happened to be a he and structured board meetings. He was very clear and he said, look, I'm not doing this for the sake of ego. If we have a board meeting, we will have the papers ready for that board meeting 4 working days in advance of the board meeting. That is my rule, and we are going to stick to it. And I will not accept, albeit, of course, to some personal reasons, potentially. But in general, if those papers are not ready, it is not going to be on the agenda. We're not discussing it. That's not the way we work. It worked in that organization because everybody knew where we stood. No one was in any doubt that if we didn't get our act together as executives with our papers on time, not at the last minute, we all knew where we stood. None of this, I'll bring it up as A or B. No, you don't do that. But he was very, very fair as well. And I'll give you an example of what he actually said to me. He said, if I think you've written a good report with a good business case that can be clearly understood by anybody around the board who maybe hasn't got a finance discipline, I may disagree with you, but if I think you've done a good job in leading us into that debate, I will tell you my challenges up front, and you will be able to prepare for those challenges so that you have the opportunity to present again your case in person. The alternative view to that was, he said, if I really think you're flying by the seat of your pants and you're not really doing a good job, I may not give you that luxury of questions in advance, and we'll have that debate on the floor, as it were. And again, everybody knew where they stood. It was very, very clear. So I think supporting your executives as a non-executive, really important. Give you one example of when it didn't quite work and didn't quite go according to plan, in that there was a very, very structured business case. In this case, for example, for the appointment of an advisor to an organization, the case had been made. It was very clear. It was backed up by evidence and fact and a business case, which is always great if you're looking to see that as a non-exec director. But it was quite clear that one of the non-exec directors at the time had a different personal view. And that non-exec director was quite difficult to work with on this issue because their personal opinion came through, but it was not matched by any evidence or fact or anything else. And that individual NED, I thought it was actually quite embarrassing at one point because they were trying to change the view of the executives purely for personal taste. Whereas other people around the board in a non-exec capacity, actually, I've had subsequent conversations that said, actually, we really did appreciate the choice that you were making. We weren't 100% convinced about it, but there was no reason for us to disagree and not back the executive because you'd made the case. So I think that ability to back the executive after having challenged them, I think was really key as well. And that made the executive really comfortable that they were receiving really good challenge, but they also felt backed by the NEDs as well.
So when you're on, I guess, when you're looking for NED roles, how do you have you had bad roles or roles you haven't enjoyed as an NED? yourself, and what were some of the things that caused that lack of enjoyment within the
Yeah,
role?
I think it's another good question, really, in that I think for anybody who's in an NED role and anybody thinking of applying to an NED role, it's unbelievably competitive. And I think that's one of the challenges I think we can make really, really clear. There are so many fantastic candidates to be put in the position of an NED role, in charge of strategy of an organization, helping really, really good executives as well. So the talent pool feels enormous. I personally take the view that I like to think about being considered for an NED role because I have a real alignment with either the business model, the sector, the phase of the business that it's in, um, my personal experience as an executive, so I can really bring something to an NED role as opposed to just, well, I tick the governance box. And I think that's a real differentiator for me, is that I think lots of people can tick the governance box, and then I think the people choosing the NED have to make sure they get the best person and the best candidate. And that might mean that me, lots of other candidates are not the best candidate in many, many cases because the talent pool is so large. And when I've had feedback, having applied for what I consider to be really good NED roles, it's been really honest and really straightforward, which is, yeah, we really liked you, for example. And then they've given me a profile of the person who was successful. And I've been able to say, well, I would have made the same selection as well, actually, because you've given me the profile of these people, and it's really, really good. So I think it is about that, putting yourself in the best position. So applying for roles where you might get to the long list because of your experience, your ability, your indirect and direct alignment with the sector or the business model might get you to the long list. And then it might be about personal chemistry. And then I think it's about what else have you done as well. Because if I put myself as a candidate, there are many better CFOs than me in an exec career. But maybe not everybody has done a few things that I've done, and there's lots of things which other people have done, which I haven't done. So as an example, I coach and mentor. Not many people have an exec career and be a qualified coach and mentor as well. So that's a bit of a differentiator. Other people have raised money in the debt markets, in the equity markets. That might be a differentiator. Other people have worked in 250, 100, FT 100 companies. I haven't done that. I'm never, ever going to be a non-exec in that size of entity. It's just not going to happen. There are better candidates than me. So I think it's a case of understanding what you might be successful at. What can you bring that is going to make a difference to an organization, as opposed to just helping out with the governance. And there are organizations like that, particularly in the regulated sector, I think, Hannah, where people do look for example, housing. One of my roles is in the social housing and affordable housing regulated sector. And very regularly, those organizations look for specific skills in customer experience, in investment capability, in development of housing, in finance and funding, very, very specific skills based in terms of attracting people to those boards. And that might well be a way into an organization as a non-exec for people who haven't got that FT 100, 250, 350 background, who maybe might go below the radar because they're a great candidate, but just they aren't necessarily an ex-audit partner at a major firm, and they aren't an ex-legal partner at a very big commercial firm. So there might well be different ways in. So I would offer this, having been successful in applying to some roles and unsuccessful in more roles than I've applied to. Think about what you can offer. Think about what you specifically can bring, and maybe try and think about it from the organizational point of view. What makes your experience and your CV stand out? And it might be that you do some voluntary NED or trustee roles. which might give you that flavor and that experience of working in an organization but sitting on the other side of the table. And that might be the differentiator that says, we can see that John or Jane has experienced life from a strategic non-exec position in a different kind of organization. There's plenty of roles like that available.
And have you ever taken an NED role and it's not quite gone to plan?
Yes, I have actually. Relatively small, and it didn't go to plan because, there was one other lady who's a non-exec at the same time. We formed the same view actually, without necessarily providing a consensus to each other. And it didn't quite go according to plan because I think there was too much of a request for it to be a part-time executive role. And I think that's one of the traps in some of the smaller NED roles. You can almost read between the lines and it sounds like a part-time exec role or a fractional role as opposed to a proper hands-off strategic non-executive independent role. And there was an element of that. And I think the biggest challenge in this particular role was the quality of information. So when requesting that kind of the information that to be an independent NED, which was the template for the role, the information wasn't forthcoming. So in that position, the independent NEDs unable to carry out their statutory duties. And I think it's important to realize as well that if you're a non-exec director, you're still on the hook for an awful lot of things in the Companies Act 2006. You're still a director of the organization, you still have responsibility, and you can't really delegate the accountability for it just because you're an independent. If your name is at Companies House, you're a director, and therefore you take accountability. So my colleague and I found that quite difficult to do without having requested on a number of occasions the kind of information that would enable us to carry out our duties successfully, and we had to part ways. So it's quite an interesting learning curve around that. Again, was anybody particularly at fault? Was anybody doing anything wrong? Not necessarily, but it just wasn't working.
One of the hardest things, I think, is actually putting into words what it means to work with myself and the team here at ITAS. Because not only are we a financial transformation consultancy, but we do it using Sage technology. So rather than me tell you how awesome we are, let me introduce one of our customers.
I'd recommend ITAS as a Sage partner, not only because of their knowledge that they have on the product itself, Intact, but also their friendly and professional approach to the whole project. They've been incredibly flexible throughout the process, but also challenging us as a customer to really think about what it is that we're after, and ensuring that Intact was actually the correct solution for us to meet our needs, which was really refreshing rather than feeling we're just being sold a product that they offer. We've got on really well with the whole team. They've been hugely approachable, helpful throughout the whole process, really putting it as at ease if anything we kind of felt we were struggling with or difficult. It really helped us to understand some of the complexities with the new system that's different to other finance systems, things that we've just never come across before, like the new dimensions and understanding how that actually works.
And that's an interesting differential. Like, where do you draw on the line between that sort of fractional advisory role versus a true NED role? What's your perspective on that?
Try and combine the circumstances from both my exec career and non-exec career, Hannah, and that I put myself now in the position of thinking, when I see board output from the executives, I think everybody in an independent NED role has to be able to understand the information without any kind of subject matter expertise. So if I'm reading a people director report or a chief technical officer report, I should be able to understand it. In the same way, anybody producing a finance report, it should be able to be clearly understood in terms of the information that's being made available, to enable that NED to challenge the strategy without obstructing progress, to bridge the financial acumen with commercial experience and execution. And it should be able to be turned around so you can support and help the executive team. And where I've had challenges has been where metaphorically you have independent NEDs driving off into the car park, out of the car park, potentially having formed different conclusions from the same information that's been presented to independent NEDs. So I think it needs to be, and this might be a learning experience for the executives as well, independent NEDs need to come out of those meetings, and if you were to ask them individually, what were your conclusions, they should all come to the same conclusion. And sometimes that's not the case. You ask somebody, what was your takeaway from that finance report, that people report? And then you ask a different NED and they come to a different conclusion. And that's a sign that not everything is quite right and might be a learning experience. So I think that's a real challenge. And I think as you go through, and like many boards, you should do your own review of effectiveness as well. So I think in all of my roles, we do an annual review of effectiveness at different scales, because we ask the executives to manage their performance reviews. We should ask ourselves how our performance has been as well. So whether that's done either internally or through internal challenge, 360-degree feedback, or whether you invite people in who are experts in that field to observe how you run a board meeting and contribute in a board meeting. But we shouldn't be left alone as if we know absolutely everything that's happening. We should be challenged in our own performance as non-executives as well.
You mentioned obviously staying on the NED side of the table when getting involved in a business. How, say you with your CFO experience, you see an issue on something, that's maybe only somebody with your finance background would notice. How do you address that with that executive, and how do you find the balance between not telling them how to their job, but making sure that, I guess, you're doing what's best for the business?
Yeah, good question. And again, applies to, I think, any particular discipline. I think it goes back to one of the earlier comments in that it would be good to think you have a relationship with that executive. And if you've got information ahead of any kind of forum, any meeting, to be able to challenge that executive outside of the boardroom, not to avoid debate in the boardroom, but to help the debate in the boardroom. So reading reports and explaining outside of the meeting, ahead of the meeting, for example, I'm really just not getting this. I don't understand what you're trying to tell me. If I'm struggling with a finance background, I'm sure my colleagues might be struggling with a non-finance background. These are the points that I don't think we're able to resolve through your reporting or through your observations. So I think giving people advance warning is really helpful. I think on that other side of the table, trying to get the executives to work on a strategic sense. One of the things I see, and my businesses that I work with are not the FT 350, 250, 100 size. They're of the 25 to 250 to 300 million revenue size of organization. Some of those organizations are also making a transition into working with non-executives as well. So they need to build their presence around the boardroom by not just repeating executive presentations, for example, which might be quite long, might be full of quite a lot of detail, and might not be as strategic as they could be. So our challenge there as independent NEDs is to try and coach and mentor those teams to behave and act somewhat differently as well. And I'm quite fortunate, I think, in the organizations I work with, they're very receptive to that. And maybe in other organizations, it might be different. But that's how I see we can add some real value as well without necessarily telling people what to do. And I'll give you a poor quality example of an NED that I worked with quite some time ago. So that gives you quite a lot of freedom in terms of, if you were to look at my LinkedIn profile, which organization was it? But I had one NED who did treat the monthly sessions as being a part-time chief exec. And I think I can almost hear this person saying, I think we were hiring some people, for example, and the response came back, well, if I was in your shoes, I can recruit this person at whatever it is, £2 an hour less, whatever. That isn't the role of a non-executive for me. I will challenge people around where we're recruiting our talent pool from, how we're managing to get the best value for money. I wouldn't be coming along and saying, well, my daughter works in this organization and she's able to recruit at £20 an hour less or something like that. So I think it is a case of really being that valuing the thinking time. And I think if you can get that NED quality of really aligned experience, why should I recruit you? What's the difference? But also being able to, in my own organizations, try and become an element of a coach and a mentor as well. That's a good balance to have. It might not work for everybody, and as I say, lots of organizations will have their own views on how to recruit a non-exec director. They probably won't all agree with me.
And what's been the biggest challenge for you personally in making the shift into that NED role? Was there one role that was harder than others or more challenging than others?
Interesting. Each of the roles I have, I don't wish to sound in any way arrogant, but there's a reason I got the role. And I'll give you one example. It's an organization that is planning to become a listed entity in the UK. And they very specifically wanted somebody with a finance background who'd been through a listing process as an executive and who had the experience of raising equity and raising debt and had worked in an international organization with operations in multiple territories. I think going back to why was I on the long list for that is that I happened to tick all of those boxes. So I felt as if I could really add something to that organization from the start. And then the rest of it perhaps down to chemistry. I happened to work with a fantastic chairwoman in that organization as well, who I just happened to get on very well with, got along with the executives. That particular organization, going back to some of the challenges, it is absolutely global. So we end up having board meetings very early in the morning to cope with the Far East, and perhaps late in the evening to cope with the US as well, particularly on the West Coast also. And that's, again, an element of the sacrifice that you're making, which is one time zone doesn't fit all, and somebody has to lose out on occasions. So I think that, some of those, why have I got some of those NED roles? I really did tick some of the boxes. In other NED roles, which I thought I could add value, I'm just not. And I'm not ticking enough boxes. So I think if you look at yourself critically, there is a reason that you don't get some of those roles. But I would say there's a very big talent pool out there, and it's difficult to break into. And I've heard many people say that the most challenging NED role to get is the very first one. And that might have to be something which is at the lower end of the remuneration scale, and maybe within an organization who perhaps is looking for a very specific skill, maybe in a regulated sector, or maybe being a trustee in an organization as well, because it just gives you that experience of being on the different side of the table.
And what advice, you mentioned obviously the first role is the most difficult. What advice would you give to somebody that is an aspiring NED that's looking to get that first role, or maybe has got it and it's their sort of first year in post? What advice would you have?
Yeah, two questions I think there. I would challenge you to look critically at your own CV, because your CV as an executive to become the next CEO or CFO, Chief Revenue Officer, CTO, I think needs to be presented completely differently to be a non-exec director. So all of those technical skills that have got you to perhaps where you've partly got to in your career, and maybe you're making that transition from subject matter expert to leader, strategic leader. So you've already made some kind of shift anyway in your mindset, is that you're not just a subject matter expert anyway. If I take my own discipline, finance, just being the best financial controller isn't going to make you the best CFO. Completely different mindset shift. And I think the same would apply to going for those NED roles as well. What are you going to offer the board that will really benefit the board? Because the likelihood is that, let's take my discipline again, they've probably got a very good CFO. So they're not looking to you to challenge the CFO on the best way to account for long-term contract revenues, for example. What they are looking at you to do is to be part of the growth story, not just the governance, because you can do outsourced governance. I'm working with an organization in a completely different coaching and mentoring capacity at the moment, where they're outsourcing a lot of their governance requirements. They have an outsourced company secretary. They have an outsourced fractional capability to do annual reports and half-year reports, and they can do that, and that's working really, really well for them. So I think what you can do in applying for roles is be really critical. What am I offering them that they can't, that another 100 people are going to replicate? So whether that's something outside of your discipline, what's your continuous learning program, for example? Have you just stopped learning? Have you stopped doing anything differently? Do you work for the local village hall? Do you work for a local charity? Something along those lines. Anything that just demonstrates that you can do something different and strategic from a different perspective. And then I think when you're in the role, I think there is that a responsibility individually to do quite a lot of onboarding practice yourself. So make the time to engage with the executive team, even if it's only for, I'll come to the board meeting an hour early and I'll have half an hour with so-and-so and half an hour with somebody else. That half an hour can be really critical, because when I say this to executives, actually, when I'm coaching and mentoring, a non-exec may only get 2 hours physical contact with you, not even physical contact now, virtual contact with you once a month. That might be it. You might have a very focused board meeting. So those non-execs are making a view on the executives in 2 hours a month. And as an executive, you may only be speaking for a very short space of time. And I think the reverse applies as well. They're looking at you, thinking, what's this person adding to me around the board? Are they helping me? What can I learn from them? Is a good and positive response. But they could also be thinking, why are they demonstrating to me as an executive that I should listen to them? So anything that you can do relationship-wise, discussion-wise, offering some experience, touring the sites is a really good thing to do. Not necessarily because you want to go around factories, although I do find that very interesting. But whilst you're in the car or on the minibus, I've had some of the best conversations with executives when I'm driving around, looking at the sites, looking at developments, and being sat next to not just the executives, but also the other non-executives as well. So being sat next to the chairperson, and I'm speaking absolutely literally on this basis, I sat next to the chair of an organization on a minibus when we're touring sites for a couple of hours off and on, and we had a great conversation. And I found out more about how he thought from the time on the minibus than I did from the board meeting, just about how they thought and what their experiences were. Because it's as I mentioned, Hannah, and you know this as well, it's such a big talent pool and lots of people can tick the governance box. So how are you going to demonstrate that you can add even more as a non-executive would be the question to ask oneself, I think.
And you mentioned obviously the importance of building relationships with the exec team. How do you talk? Have you ever had an issue with a particular executive as part of that piece, and how did you handle that situation?
I think the answer to that is yes, and I'd probably revert back again to the fact that some of those executives, they will be learning. I'm sure they all want to get better in their executive roles as well. So I think it's being presented in a challenging way, but one which is supportive as well. So hesitate to go anywhere near the kind of phrase which is, well, this is the way I would do it. That's a real turn off, and it would have been for me as an executive. But having had a conversation very recently, actually, in the last few days, around asking the challenging questions in almost a coaching way. What were you expecting non-execs to conclude from your report? Did you think you explained the different bookends of the conclusions well enough in your report? And try and do that again outside of the board meeting rather than being, use the phrase, ambushed in a meeting. I never appreciated that as an executive, by being ambushed. But I'm quite happy to be given challenge when you've got the opportunity to respond in the right way as well. So I think consistent relationships, not just one-off critiques, I think works really well. And I think you need to support the leadership without slowing them down, because there's a reason they're in those executive leadership roles. More often than not, they're actually pretty good.
And when you've talked obviously about building relationship with executives. What about the rest of the board? How much time do you dedicate to building your wider NED relationships with other NEDs?
Good question again, and probably take the view that the kind of functions that you need to attend are ones that put you into, I think, more contact with not just your own non-executives, but perhaps with others as well. I'm not an avid networker at functions where there's 100 or 200 people. But again, going back to one of the more recent building blocks of a relationship that I attended, things that perhaps are termed strategy days, maybe it's not all about the strategy, but if you're in the same room and same function area with perhaps an overnight with the rest of your non-exec team, again, you can have a lot more conversation over dinner, over breakfast, in and outside, in the breakouts, and you get to know those non-execs a lot better. So again, it's not rocket science, is it? And I'm sure there's other ways of doing things, and other people would have different views. But for example, I spent 26 hours at a strategy day just before Christmas, beginning of December. Really good content in terms of, it was a mixture of executives and non-execs. We also brought some external people in to talk about the sector. We had lots of breakouts. We had lots of opportunity to converse with our peers, executive and non-executive. I came away from that thinking I know everybody a lot better, and I know the business a lot better as well. So therefore, I'm hopefully in a position to do my job a little bit better as well.
And now you're on the other side of the fence. If looking back, how would you have changed what you did as a CFO, knowing what you do now about the NED role?
Great question. I'd focus more on the interpretation. And I think maybe the danger as an executive is to keep on justifying your existence with a more is better approach. I'm sure we've all been in the position where executives give us very detailed reports, which are very interesting. It's full of data. I think as a non-exec, you're almost taking that as read. And what you really want is to be able to read summary conclusions and reports. And the way I coach and work with executives is I personally like to see reports in a particular style, no matter who's writing it. So I personally like to see reports from finance and sales and operations with number one, it's the title. Section number two is the author. Section number three, tell me why I'm reading it. Is it for governance? Is it for noting? Is it for decision making? So already, by just those three things, I know why I'm reading it, who's writing it. Number four, executive summary. Number five, what's my strategic conclusion of that report? And then I've got the option as a non-exec as to whether invest more and more of my time reading the rest of the report. I'm sure lots of people have been in a situation where you get to the end of a report, 15, 20 pages long, you still don't know what the conclusion is or why you've read it. Why am I reading this? So that's perhaps something for executives to think about, in that non-execs haven't got the time. And I'm quite fortunate I do have the time. I've worked with other non-execs who, because of various commitments, they just literally don't have the time. And it's not because they're not devoting the time. They have very structured days. And if things aren't able to be concluded in their 2-hour window, it's very difficult for them. So I think put yourself in the mind as an executive of, I'm a non-executive. I may have a board meeting on company A in the morning. I have a board meeting on company B in the afternoon. And surprise, surprise, how many organizations have board meetings in week 3 of the month? So that's the way it works. We all know that's the way it works, is that board meetings take place potentially, usually week 3 of the month. So if you're in that week 3 as a non-executive, that's why I think we need to be reliant upon information being presented in the same way at the right time, so we can digest the information and do our job as an independent director, supporting the executives, challenging them, but helping them with the growth and the progress of the entity as well.
So, final question for this session, because it's been such a great one, Jeremy. So, thank you again. What would be your top tips for a new non-executive director? So, they've just got their first role, they're about to start. What would you give them as sort of their advice for the first 6 months, say?
I would go back to a phrase that I've used a number of times, that never undervalue thinking time. Thinking time as opposed to operational time, I think, is really, really important as a non-exec director. As a first-time not independent director, or going into a new non-exec role, again, I'd be focusing upon the growth, not the governance. And with an element of good judgment and good luck, you would hope that the governance is already in place. And maybe there are non-exec roles which are there to fix the governance, and there are some of those around. And there's nothing wrong with that either. But support the growth. And again, I'd go back to the phrase I used earlier on in this session. I think your job is to be a full-time independent non-executive and avoid being a part-time executive. That's not helpful, I think, to the existing executives who are looking for strategic advice and strategic guidance. And I think bridging that gap is maybe the challenge, thinking that all your experience and all of your skills must be valued by the organization. I'm sure they are, but I think you need to operate with that different mindset, which is, how am I helping the whole organization address the challenges that they are facing?
Amazing advice. Now, obviously, Jeremy, you're not just a non-exec director yourself, you're also a coach. So if people would like help and advice about making that transition to that non-exec role, where can they find you, and what help and support can you offer?
They can find me at my website. I have a coaching practice, which is clarendoncoaching.com. So Clarendon Coaching, all one word.com. So you find my website. I deal specifically with people making that transition into higher roles, whether that be aspirational executives going to the next level and people working towards a non-exec position as well. I'm quite visible on LinkedIn. There's not too many people with the same name as me, so you'll find me by searching on my name. The other individual who you come up with if you search on my name is some Canadian guy who had a tragic accident some years ago, drowning. It's not. I'm not them. So you find me quite easily on LinkedIn, and I do actually have my own YouTube channel as well. So I do, as you know, a weekly podcast of my own around leadership, and I try to interview a lot of non-execs actually, and a lot of executives to take their different views around leadership. So that is youtube.com/@ Jeremy Earnshaw, all one word. And I do a weekly podcast with people, guests from very, very different sectors. So military, sport, founders, entrepreneurs, education, and hopefully something in it for everybody. And I'm not selling anything there. I'm just offering the opportunity for different people to give their views on leadership, which might be helpful to anybody who's watching this.
Amazing. Well, and for all of our listeners, if you've enjoyed this episode, please do let me know. It'd be great to have your thoughts and comments on maybe there's a question I missed asking. And of course, all of those links that Jeremy mentioned, we will pop in the show notes to make it nice and easy for you. So a massive thank you, Jeremy. Thank you for joining me on the show and sharing your insight. And as always, some great points and takeaways for our listeners.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Real pleasure to be invited again. Thank you for that.
One of the hardest things, I think, is actually putting into words what it means to work with myself and the team here at ITAS. Because not only are we a financial transformation consultancy, but we do it using Sage technology. So rather than me tell you how awesome we are, let me introduce one of our customers.
Working with ITAS has dramatically made our lives simpler because there's just such a knowledgeable team there to help us. Before, we felt the consultants we were working with at another company, it was always a challenge to get information out of them, for them to understand the problem, and it just didn't feel like they were on our team. Working with ITAS, it's almost, we feel like you are all employed with us to work with us to do it. It's an absolutely fantastic relationship, and it's just made it such a smoother process and an absolute fun process working in Sage Intact and coming on our calls. I look forward to it now.